Three, two, one, and welcome. My name is Larry Staub III, and today I will be covering everything that I learned in ecology and evolutionary biology for my final project as I studied in Bio 146. So today's questions and topics, we're going to be first covering phylogeny, and then life histories, moving into evolution, and then closing up with climate change. So let's get started. Question 1. Explain the evolution behind one major phylogenetic tree. Just a little bit of background information. What is phylogeny? Well, it reflects how a species or a group has evolved from a series of common ancestors. And you can tell by this tree over here, this is where the most recent common ancestor would be for all of these. And it's going to be the oldest. Then it moves into different nodes and different branches. So A would be the longest, the most ancient, as you could say, while H would be the most evolved species. And the diagram just represents different evolutionary relationships. And then I also thought it was interesting that these trees are just hypothesized and they're not actually derived to be factual, although it does make a lot of sense. They're just not definitive facts because it's kind of impossible to prove that it is the case. But moving into a specific phylogeny in a tree, we want to talk about plants. So plants have a lot of different traits. We all know that they were once all aquatic and all green algae, and then they started deriving new traits. First, an embryo to help protect the little algae guy, and then he could be more protected from predators and whatnot. And then he developed vascular tissue, which was used to help move nutrients and water throughout its cells. And going into that, it kind of evolved to two different things: microphylls, which have one vein, and then megaphylls, which have two or more veins to help move all that nutrients. And then the plants just started getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Then we go into seeds, which would be very, very helpful to help move the pollen and move the sperm around, so it doesn't just have to float around in the water like the moss does. A seed can travel farther too. And then finally, plants develop flowers, which were used to help attract different pollination insects, such as bumblebees and things of that nature. But I want to touch upon some modern phylogeny. I thought it was interesting that there's this fungus that's a delicacy in the Middle East, and it's very weather dependent on their growth rate. So if it's a very dry season, they're not going to get a lot of this. And people go crazy for this stuff. It's very expensive. So Israel has managed to decode the relationship between the fungus and its host plant. And both of them require little water and no fertilization. So they were able to change the genetic makeup of this fungus and then also in turn change the phylogenetic tree by making their very own species, which I thought was pretty fascinating. Moving into question 2, we're going to discuss the life histories of a species. So what are life histories? A quick little background. They're a schedule of growth, reproduction, and death. And there's two generalized life history strategies. One is the K-selected species, and then the other is the R-selected species. And you look at the K versus the R, and they're basically opposite in every category. K has a low number of offspring, while R has numerous offsprings. K has a low gestation period. R has a long gestation period. R has a short gestation period. K has slower maturation, and R has a faster maturation. But I think the most important one is when you get to the extended parental care versus the minimal parental care. Basically, in the K-selected species, you kind of can think, is the parent gonna just have a bunch of babies and then kind of leave them for their own, or do you think they're gonna care for them a lot? That's kind of how I remember K-selected, K kind of for care. And moving into the reproductive strategies, this kind of falls right in there with the Semoparis, the more R-selected species, because there's a single reproductive episode and then they die. You can think more of like insects here. I know a lot of spiders, or will just have like a ton of eggs and then die like right after. But iteroparis is the opposite, with multiple reproductive episodes before death. And a lot of mammals fall into this category, and one of them would be humans. So I wanted to talk about one specific life history, and that would be the horse. I kind of think horses are cool. I don't want to consider myself an equestrian, but I like riding horses. Got a chance to do that out west. It's beautiful, and they're just really cool creatures. So I want to learn a little more about them. Obviously, they're case selected because they do have a low number of offsprings, and like I said, a lot of mammals are case selected as well. And they're also iteroparous, meaning that they can have more than one baby in their lifetime. But then we start to understand how a horse became a horse. And it's hypothesized that they're derived from a dog. They have a lot of similar structures, but they had to begin to adapt to open grassland habitats. And this is what started to begin to change the structure of their limbs, specifically on the reduction of their toes touching the ground, which from a paw to a hoof was developed. And then this helped them um, not only run faster, but also to escape predators better. And then another change occurred in their tooth structure, going from more sharp teeth to, kind of like molars, more of a grinder tooth. And that was as they had to change from being a browser to a grazer. Question 3, in what ways are humans evolving? So just as the horse evolved, humans are evolving too. And this kind of threw me for a loop at first. In what ways are humans evolving? I'm not, I consider myself kind of a history buff, and you look at like the history books, like George Washington, like 200 years ago, he looks pretty similar to me. So how could humans keep continuing to evolve? I kind of didn't really know. So I started doing some research. And there's this thing out there called the grandmother hypothesis, and it goes something like this. Living long enough to help take care of your grandchildren makes them more likely to survive, and therefore makes your own genes more likely to be passed on. This kind of makes a lot of sense, as genes causing diseases late in life would become less common over time if the grandmother hypothesis is true, and then natural selection would help to get rid of harmful genetic mutations that shorten lives. And one specific example of this is the APOE gene, which is linked to Alzheimer's disease. And a big study was conducted, and they figured out that it's rarely found in women after the age of 70, and this can be contributed to the grandmother hypothesis. But I want to talk about a couple of specific human evolutionary examples, and one would be Scandinavian people and their average height. They across all other countries, the Scandinavian populations have a much higher height than anyone else, and it's none more significant than in the Dutch, with the Dutchmen average height of being 6 foot, and that's 7.9 inches higher than it was 200 years ago. And in retrospect, Americans have grown, I think it's 2.5 inches higher in the last 200 years. And the reason for this is because more Dutch women prefer a taller man, which would make them more attractive, and they would have more offspring than anyone else in the population. And then I also thought it was interesting, I was reading that the taller women would actually want a taller guy, and if a taller girl wanted a taller guy, if they're both tall, they're going to have a larger gene pool of more tall people, and it kind of just is a snowball effect from there. And that's why most Scandinavian people have a higher average height than everyone else. And this one really hits home with me. Another human evolutionary trait is lactose intolerance. I guess everyone really should be lactose intolerant. I guess we all kind of were. Within the human, the baby has a gene that's encoded with an enzyme called lactase, and it's turned on in infancy so that the baby can drink the mother's milk and get nutrients and such. But as we get older, that gene's supposed to turn off and be suppressed, although drinking milk soon became an advantage as it has a lot of benefits like calcium and things of that nature. So people started having more cows on their farms, and they started to drink more milk. And then they acquired a mutation that allowed genes to stay turned on after infancy. And I also thought it was interesting. I read that a lot of Asian populations still are lactose intolerant because they haven't acquired that mutation that allows them to drink milk after infancy. And our last question of the day, is climate change real or a hoax? And you really got to look at it from a scientific standpoint because if you flip on CNN or Fox News, you're going to get two sides of the story. The left proposing more of a like the Green Deal as a final solution, and then the right, some people even don't even believe climate change is real. Or I know America just was withdrawn from the Paris Climate Agreement for more economic reasons than anything else. But to answer the question, I do believe that climate change is real. And as I alluded to earlier, a lot of people on the right would argue, well, we had an ice age a couple thousand years ago. Our world always goes through these climate changes, but you got to look more from an anthropogenetic climate change. That means more man-made. In the last couple 200 plus years, the average temperature of the Earth has risen 1.9 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's according to NASA. And I think they're a pretty valid source. So at this rate, 1 in 6 species is at risk for extinction, which, you're like, okay, so what? Like, who cares? But, as we learned in class, there's the keystone species, and it's a really big trickle-down domino effect. If one species were to leave that environment and leave that population, it can have a big ripple effect on every other species in that environment. But learning more about the carbon cycle, I think it's pretty hard to deny that climate change is real. A lot of people argue that, well, trees, they suck up CO2, so, what's the big deal? But with the burning of fossil fuels, especially in the last 5 decades, it's risen to higher global temperatures because there's I think it's 30% more CO2 in our environment since in the last 200 years. And basically, there's a surplus of CO2, and it's acting as an insulator to trap heat, and it prevents that heat from escaping, which is what helped to make our world not an ice age because at one point it all just escaped and it was really, really cold. So now there's too much CO2 and it's getting really, really hot. So I do believe climate change is real, just to reiterate my final point. And I think, in conclusion, this quote kind of sums up more or less everything that we've covered in class. And it says, the only constant in nature is change. And that really kind of hit home for me. And I think it really sums up basically everything that we've covered through Darwinism, evolution, natural selection, everything like that. You either get busy living or get busy dying. And I think throughout these changes, nature is pretty amazing. And I definitely learned a lot in this class, things that I really never really took much thought to. And I'm very thankful I took this class. Bio 146 really opened my eyes to a lot of different perspectives in the world. And I was able to read all these really cool articles in order to help craft this project. And here's a couple more for you. And I just want to give a quick thank you to Bio 146. Learned a lot, had a lot of great things to come home to my buddies about and instruct them all about. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed my project. Hope you learned something. I know I did. So have a great summer, and I look forward to seeing you next year.